Mr. Chairman, my amendment would ensure that this legislation would not go into effect until the Secretary certifies that its implementation would not result in increased litigation. This legislation makes significant changes to key provisions of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. There is little doubt that these changes will lead to increased litigation. These concerns are not unfounded. The 1996 MSA reauthorization included several new definitions and national standards. The bill before us makes similar changes. The implementation of that reauthorization was met with hundreds of lawsuits. When Mr. Go-Relnick, chair of the Council Coordination Committee, testified before the Water, Oceans, and Wildlife Subcommittee last year, he warned that H.R. 4690, quote, may increase litigation risk with respect to minimizing adverse effects of fishing on habitat and minimizing bycatch, end quote. With regard to bycatch, he specifically warned that removing the phrase, quote, to the extent practicable, end quote, would require councils to set, quote, levels of bycatch that could be considered to be minimized is very subjective with wide extremes and thus open to litigation. As to what an acceptable level of bycatch might be, that is one of the several examples included in his testimony. Clearly, we should be worried that this legislation would force the agency to waste time and resources defending itself from frivolous lawsuits to the detriment of its core mission. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment. Before I leave this topic, though, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to point out and go back to the section we discussed earlier, section 501, and call out the lack of clear definitions of such things as what is all of adverse effect or any adverse effect. And the fact that any of these unfortunately vague definitions will result in lawsuits. Also was taken by the discussion of removal of dams, and it struck me that indeed, if one looks at the page 148 and looks at line 17 on down over into the next page, in a habitat area, quote, of particular concern, end quote, each federal agency shall, in consultation with the Secretary, quote, paragraph, for the entire period during which such adverse effect is likely to occur, monitor or require monitoring for such adverse effect. Okay, it's kind of interesting. I guess what that means is, because there's always a referral back when these points are raised to the word consultation, that somehow the Secretary could say, well, don't worry about it, you've consulted, and we're just going to waive the monitoring. That's what that means, doesn't it? I mean, it means that indeed, this could be waived, right? It's not a requirement, is it?
Is that a question?
It is, Mr. Chair.
I'll tell you what I'll say about that, Mr. Benz. I'm happy to keep working with you on clarity because it sounds like you've honed in on a few things that you think are ambiguous or uncertain and could be could foster more anticipation or more litigation. So I'm happy to keep working on those things, but I don't think an amendment that stops the entire law from taking an effect while the Secretary makes some hypothetical determination about litigation is the way to address that. I think it's better to work with us on the language.
I think it's safe to say, Mr. Chair, thank you for your thoughts on that. I think it's safe to say that it would be unlikely that the changes I have in mind would be adopted, because what I have in mind is something that would prevent the imposition of additional dramatic cost on all federal projects that store water. And what this does, the way this is set up, is it would allow, actually, I think it would force those who are utilizing dams to pay for the, quote, adverse impact. They certainly monitor it, and then if you go into the next paragraph, again, moving from paragraph 148 to 149, it says, for the entire period during which such adverse effect is likely to occur, quote, take action to minimize and mitigate such adverse effect of the action. And so when you talked about relicensing those dams, if the relicensing of the dams were to cause this unfortunate adverse effect, then whatever the measure of mitigation might be is what those who are trying to take advantage of this federal action, they would have to pay. And to me, that's wrong, and I think that's what my amendment is intended to raise. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.